I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for this introductory lesson on state open meeting laws. If you haven't already, please view our previous lessons on open meetings, state public record laws, and the Federal Freedom of Information Act. They can all be found on our YouTube channel as well as in our FOI guide at NEFAC.org. Before we begin this lesson, a special thanks to those helping us make these classes happen: the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, SPJ New England, the Rhode Island Foundation, MuckRock, and the New England Society of News Editors. We appreciate everyone's support. Now, to introduce you to today's instructor, NEFAC's Emily Sweeney.
This session right now is going to focus on executive sessions in Rhode Island. And with us today is NEFAC's Tim White, an investigative journalist for WPRI in Providence, who's going to share a story about a government agency holding an executive session, which is basically a secret meeting allowed only under certain circumstances. And he's going to talk about how he and his colleagues responded to this meeting and continued their reporting. Tim, thanks so much for being here today.
Emily, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. We're seeing more and more agencies leaning into executive or closed session meetings. So it's an important topic to discuss. So why don't we, let me just set the stage a little bit for this story, if I could, before I play a short video, so you can experience what the journalists in the field experienced that day, just to understand a little of the context of why we were covering this sort of bizarre, open but not open public meeting. In October 2021, myself and my colleague Eli Sherman broke a story about a former basketball coach at a community here in Rhode Island at North Kingstown High School, who, as our reporting showed, would routinely take students into his office, ask them to strip naked and conduct so-called fat tests on them and other examinations. This was done, obviously, or as we found out, without parental consent. Our reporting uncovered the school had been notified about this inappropriate behavior back in 2018, but little was done at that time. Then in early 2021, it came up again before the school board. An internal investigation was authorized by the committee. An attorney recommended the coach's firing, but instead of firing him, they let him resign, and thus he was then rehired at a Catholic school in the town next door. When we reached out to that Catholic school to ask if they knew anything about the allegations and the investigation in neighboring North Kingstown, the former basketball coach was immediately terminated from employment there. So what we found out through our reporting was this behavior spanned decades. We found and we talked to former students, now adults, who, as they became parents, realized what had happened to them was wrong. And I should note, the day after we filed our story, Amanda Malkovich from the Boston Globe also filed her version of the story with very, very similar findings. So it was getting a lot of attention. After we filed our report and Amanda filed hers, the school committee called an emergency school board meeting, and it was to take place early on a Saturday morning. So just so people understand, by law, an open meetings announcement has to happen 48 hours prior to a meeting. So the earliest they could call it, based on when they wanted to make the announcement, was early on a Saturday morning. I went and covered that along with other reporters, and I'm going to share my screen and just play for you what happened that day. In a two-page statement sent to parents after the meeting, the school committee says while they have no information that indicates any member of the school administration acted inappropriately in response to the allegations, they have voted to continue their investigation to see if that remains the case.
Here we go, Tim.
After 6 hours behind closed doors with the North Kingstown School Committee, Superintendent Philip Auger declined to answer questions. Mr. Auger, can we have a minute here?
We don't have a statement right now. We have statements.
No, that's okay.
We sent statements to the community.
But I think the community would like to hear from you.
Well, we have sent a statement to the community.
Yeah,
Thank
but I'd
you.
like to ask you a couple of questions.
Excuse me.
What did you
Excuse
do
me.
in 2018?
Excuse me.
The day began like this.
Aga must go! Aga must go!
Protesters calling for Auger and others to resign.
Leave our children alone!
They gathered ahead of an unusual school committee meeting on Saturday morning that was called to order.
This is a meeting of the North Kingstown School Committee. I need a motion to open the meeting.
In the parking lot.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
Then the committee members disappeared into the building for a marathon closed-door executive session, a move that did not sit well with many who were there.
So we have a right to be here.
This seems like a big old cover-up to me, and for this to go, and get brushed under the carpet, someone's got to be held accountable.
The meeting comes in the wake of a Target 12 investigation where former student athletes came forward to say for years their basketball coach Aaron Thomas would have some of them stripped naked to conduct so-called fat tests behind closed doors.
We loved this man, you know what I mean? We trusted him. He was our kids' basketball coach. He was the comms teacher, which is a super popular program in the school.
You feel like the school department let the community down?
Absolutely, they let the community down.
On Friday, Thomas was fired from his new job at private Catholic school Monsignor Clark, where he landed a teaching job after resigning North Kingstown in June. The principal at Monsignor Clark says they were never told of the allegations.
I'm appalled. I mean, they knew that allowing him to resign was going to basically allow him to go get another job.
Thomas has repeatedly denied our requests for comment.
Okay, so before we get into how we handled that situation moving forward and actually what we did leading up to that, I just want to provide everybody with a very brief update on what has transpired since that meeting. An internal investigation confirmed our findings, and that superintendent, as well as other school officials, resigned. The department is still actually without a permanent leader right now. The U.S. Attorney's Office has launched a federal civil rights violation. More people have come forward, and it launched a criminal investigation. And I can just play this quick. This is an arraignment of Aaron Thomas. He was charged with, criminally in this case. And so obviously we covered that as well. So big significant updates since that weird meeting. And look, the entire thing was bizarre because you had the protesters there in the parking lot. Obviously, a lot of people were very upset. But what was truly unusual was the meeting was called to order in a parking lot. And then they immediately voted to go into executive session. You could see I had to put my mic right up to the chair of the school committee there. I think instead, of course, we'll talk about what we did moving forward, but when it comes to open meetings in general, including this one that we covered here, a big chunk of the work, Emily, needs to be done ahead of time, right? When an agenda is posted, it's a good practice to make sure that you're calling members of the agency and ask questions about the meeting, especially any items that are in executive session. And I think the benefit to that is twofold. First of all, it's just for you as a reporter or a member of the public, understanding what is going to happen and what you need to expect going into the meeting. Very basic. But it also, I think, sends a signal to them, to the agency that you're covering, that you are very interested in this meeting, and ask them when to expect, or when the public should expect, when they will know what happens, what occurred in executive session. So you're sort of setting the stage that there's an expectation that whatever happened behind closed doors isn't going to stay that way forever. And if you should ask them that if any votes happen in executive session, are you going to disclose those votes when you return to open meeting? And that is by law. They cannot take a vote in executive session and not have that disclosed when they return into open session. So just sort of letting them know that you understand the rules, you're plugged in, you're going to be there, and they should know that. And I think most importantly, don't be afraid to ask why. Why is this particular item going to be discussed in executive session as opposed to open session? And there's a few things to understand about, and now I'm obviously leaning into Rhode Island law, and for anybody else who's watching this, that is in another state. Open meeting laws tend to be very similar, but there are, of course, nuances and changes state by state. So read your Open Meetings Act in your state, become very familiar with it, so you're empowered when you have these conversations and when you're sitting in the meeting. So you saw it in my video there, a majority of the school committee had to vote to go into closed session. And I have covered things where there's a disagreement on the board as to whether they go in executive session, closed session. As a reporter, that's great, because then you have a little bit of drama and that adds to your narrative. And sometimes just being there as a reporter, people might be a little bit reluctant to go into closed session because they know you're going to, or you should, you're going to write about it. They also must state a reason publicly why they are going into closed session. And this is really important. If they don't, you should stand up and ask why, and don't be afraid to do that. The reason that they give must fall under one of several enumerated reasons that are listed in the state law. If it's not there, they cannot go into closed session. So like I said, get to know your law. I mean, maybe as I think about this out loud, have it printed out in front of you. Understand what those reasons are in which they are allowed to go into executive session. So if they don't have the right reason there, you can state that, and you can make a case in the moment. You may or may not be successful, but in the moment, as to why you don't think they should be going into executive session. And like I said, any votes really should happen in open session, but if they make any decisions like a vote in closed session, they have to announce that once they return. And this goes primarily for reporters, for journalists in this case, but the power of the press is an important tool in the toolbox. Make sure that anytime you cover these things, that you write into your story when they go into closed session, and the process in which it happened, the votes, who voted to go into closed session is always important. Tell the readers and viewers what questions were left unanswered because they went behind closed doors. This will tell the agency that they can't just get away with doing it so easily. In other words, don't give them a pass. Make sure that if you're covering the meeting and a decision was made, you're not just writing about the decision, but you're letting them know that they discussed how their reasoning, how they resolved that issue behind closed doors, and then just came outside with a binary up or down vote. And that's all we know. Don't just report on the vote. Make sure you give the readers and the viewers the process of exactly what happened, like I did in that video. And now, obviously, that was sort of a made-for-TV event with all the activity that was going around, so it was a lot easier for me to write. But it really peeled back the curtain. I mean, when we were left, Amanda Malkovich and I sat on the sidewalk together for like 7 hours, sitting there with Amanda, and it was obviously an event that we could bring to viewers so they could understand tangibly what happened there. If I could just, Emily, if I have time, I'd like to bring up just one more example of a Providence licensing board hearing I covered several years ago, pre-COVID. And the licensing board issues liquor licenses to entertainment and food establishments. And there was a licensing hearing for it was a nightclub where an incident had happened, a stabbing or some shooting, or I don't recall exactly, but the police department was making an argument to the licensing board to revoke the establishment's license after the incident happened there. And the police, acting as a prosecutor in this administrative hearing, was about to show video surveillance from the club. And one of the board members looked over to me and to my photographer and told the police to turn the screen away from the public. And so in that moment, I stood up and objected to what they were doing, saying that this was an administrative hearing akin to a judicial proceeding like you would have in a courtroom. So this video that they were showing was evidence being entered into the case, if you will. So therefore, it is a public record. So I said, you can't just shield it from the public's view. And let's just be clear, if I wasn't there, they would have played it to the public in full. They were treating me differently because I was a member of the press, and not, am a member of the public, but they viewed me very differently. And this is a problem that I'm seeing more and more, not just in open meetings, but also in with public records, where, you know, a reporter walks in and all of a sudden we're treated differently. Just this week, on Tuesday, I was covering a hearing in court, and I should note that courts are not covered by the Open Meetings Act. You don't have to give 48 hours notice before a criminal or civil proceeding. But I think my little story here will give the point. I was waiting to get inside this courtroom, and I should probably note for context, the judge that I was covering in this criminal proceeding, it was a change of plea hearing, does not like the media. So his sheriff came out and looked at me in my notepad and said, "Do you have permission to be here?" I said, "Permission from who?" And he said, "From the court administrator." I said, "I don't need permission from the court administrator to go into that courtroom." He goes, "You need to get permission." And I turned and I looked at the line of the public that wanted to get in there. And I said, "Do they have to go get permission from the court administrator to go sit in that courtroom?" And I said, I want to talk to the judge. And the sheriff said, "Well, you can't talk to him. I'll go in there." I was obviously let into the courtroom, but understand that we are getting treated differently now. Again, with open meetings, I experienced it in court. That I will say that was a pretty rare event. That courts are usually great about access generally, and we're being treated differently. You know, with public records and getting police reports. And I will just say, and I'll wrap up sort of my talk on this. I think the press has a little bit. We deserve some of the blame in that. And here's what I mean. The media landscape has contracted quite a bit, and there are just fewer and fewer reporters out there, as the business side of the building has struggled in the last couple of decades. So we're getting laid off, right? I mean, just look what's happening over at Gannett. And because of that, fewer meetings are getting covered. And so what we do is we parachute into something, and the people that cover these meetings aren't used to us being there, and they clench up and get nervous. And so their reaction is to shut things down. So they view it as just being easier to close things off. It is our job as a voice in the eyes and the ears of the public, of the community that we report in. We serve the community as, you know, the fourth estate of journalism. It is our job to make sure it's not easy, and to send the message it is actually harder to be opaque than it is to be transparent in these situations. And I would argue it's cheaper to be transparent, because what I'm experiencing, particularly with public records, but this applies to our conversation on open meetings, is these things are getting litigated. So they go to the city or town solicitor, which are almost always outside counsel, except in the larger municipalities, or the agency's lawyer, again, outside counsel. So they have a finite budget. And then, you know, either I have to make the arguments on my own, which is usually the case, or if we get our attorney involved, and all of a sudden we're litigating things that, in my experience 20 years ago, was just you asked for something and they gave it to you. But that is just because I firmly believe we're having fewer interactions, particularly with these smaller agencies, these smaller government entities that just aren't used to having a reporter there. So just make sure that when you're covering these things, you're sending the message that you know, it is easier to be transparent. We're going to make it difficult if you're not being a jerk, but we're going to write about it. We're going to ask a lot of questions. We're going to cover the next meeting, and we're going to cover the next meeting, and so on and so forth. And by the way, finally, if you do think just a tool in your toolbox, last resort kind of a tool, I suppose, if you do think a meeting is going into executive session improperly, as I said before, stand up. But one thing that you can say is you can ask generally the chair of the entity if they can adjourn, so you can have time to reach out to your newsroom's attorney or to your newsroom's editor, or I would say, as a board member of NEFAC, reach out to the New England First Amendment Coalition. It just ask for time to make so you can come back and petition the agency as to why this should not be discussed in executive session. I think that's sort of a break glass in case of an emergency thing, but it is also possible that just by asking to adjourn and saying you want to go talk to a lawyer, that might give them pause, and that might, can't guarantee it, but that might then give them a change of heart, or could alter the vote as to whether or not they go into closed session. I guess the headline here is be active, right? Do your research going into the meeting so you have an understanding, and so they know that you're going to be there and they know it's important to you. And then in the moment, just know the process so you are armed with the proper information in case you need to raise an objection, if you will, to how the proceeding is being handled.
Yeah, that's really helpful advice, Tim. And great job covering that meeting. I gotta say, I've never seen like a meeting start in a parking lot.
I've been doing this for, I don't know, a quarter century. That was definitely a first for me.
Yeah, no. And you guys handled it really well, but very strange situation. And, it just shows how important our job is too, because look at all those people like just wanting to know what was going on behind closed doors. So no,
that's a good point, Emily, because a lot of people just in their day-to-day lives are so busy they can't cover they can't go to the school committee meeting or the town council meeting or that court hearing, and that's what we get paid to do, to cover it, to be there as a proxy for them, and so they can understand. So when access is choked off like that, they're not just choking off a reporter from the Boston Globe, Emily Sweeney from the Boston Globe. They're choking off the readership of the Boston Globe, the people that I, obviously voted them into power, and they need to understand that.
Yeah, without a doubt. Tim, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you got to be, you're very busy and you got to probably get on the air soon again too. So thank you so much for walking us through this. Thanks to everybody who joined us, and be sure to check out our other episodes on NEFAC's YouTube channel and on our website, nefac.org. So thanks, everybody.